Hello and welcome to the ROPESCAST, the independent voice of the Middle East. I'm Ksenia Svetlova. ROPES stands for the Regional Organization for Peace, Economics and Security. We are a young organization that works to lay the groundwork for a post-conflict Middle East by connecting forward-thinking Israeli, Palestinian and MENA region emerging leaders from all across the Middle East and North Africa. We share a holistic vision for our region, where everyone has more to win from conflict resolution and integration than to lose. If you are looking for more information on ROPES, please visit our website, ropes.org. And today we are very privileged to host our dear friend and actually an alum of ROPES, Leena Al Olaimy. Leena is systems alchemist and serial social entrepreneur. As founder and CEO of Symbaiosys, an imaginarium advancing reciprocal planetary economies and governance systems through science, technology, and art. We will ask Leena to explain all of this fancy words because I'm sure that there are at least some of us that feel a little bit confused. Leena is also a co-founder of three other impact ventures: Free BL Associates, a people and planet strategy consultancy; Public Planet Partnership, a framework for human-nature collaboration; Diversity on Board, which promotes human and modern human representation in the boardroom. And she's also an award-winning author of Compassionate Counterterrorism, the Power of Inclusion in Fighting Fundamentalism. Leena is a Fulbright Scholar, Dalai Lama Fellow, Wall Street Journal Woman of Note, Expo 2020 Global Impact Innovator, and Salzburg Global Fellow. She's listed among Bahrain's most influential women and was recognized by Change Now as one of 25 women changing our future, and in Thin Earth 101 Women in Climate Awards 2025. She has delivered 300 and more than 300 talks globally, addressing audiences like the World Economic Forum and the United Nations. Dear Leena, great to have you on the ROPESCAST. Ahlan usalan.
Helene, thank you so much for having me. It's really good to see you after so long. And also, I see we've somehow telepathically matched our outfits today.
This is important, I think. Again, only women can do it, by the way. That's a special feature. So, Leena, I will actually was dreaming to host you for a long time. And we know how very busy are you. So I'm very grateful that you found the time and you are joining us today. So you have the beautiful background of, some water and some greenery. And I don't know, is it plants on your background? I think it indicates very clearly, that you're coming from this very important sphere of, climate interaction between, human, and nature, natural resources, protection, and so on. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself in the words then also people who are not experts in the sphere also can understand, please.
Yeah, so actually the backdrop behind me is a satellite image of Mount Taranaki in New Zealand. And the reason that this, aside from being just a stunning image, the reason that it's significant is Mount Taranaki is one of several ecosystems in New Zealand that actually has personhood rights. So there's also a river, the Wanganui River, in New Zealand that has personhood rights. And what that means is nature has a legal personhood right. It has a right to exist. It has a right to sue. It has rights in court. So of course, the river and the mountain have human representatives that represent those rights. But it's really a fundamental shift in the way we relate to the natural world or the more than human world. And so the image is very symbolic, but I can share more about my work later on.
Yeah. And also for the sake of our listeners and also viewers, you are Bahraini. You were grown and raised in Bahrain. I think that, Bahrain has a little bit of a under PR problem, because it's, I think, one of the most fascinating countries in the Gulf and in, MENA region. And yet, somehow, it gets less kind of public attention, so maybe you can tell us a little bit about Bahrain, about your bringing in Bahrain, For example, you are Bahraini, I'm Israeli, we are speaking together about climate and peace. Is it something that, when you grew up, you thought that it's something that is a normal thing, or because in many parts of many regions, we know that this kind of contexts are strictly tabooed?
Yeah, so maybe I'll start with, for those who don't know, Bahrain is an island. So historically, islands and coastal kind of, countries, they always have much more exposure to other nationalities and cultures. We were, a trading sort of hub thousands of years ago, connecting Persia, Mesopotamia, South Asia. And so we've always been exposed to a lot of different cultures and religions. I grew up in a British international school, and you could easily find 15 nationalities in one classroom. So this was something that, it's not foreign to me. It's always been how I've grown up. And then in my own family, which is maybe a bit less traditional than most Bahraini families, we have, probably also more than 15 nationalities married into the family, through intermarriages from, from Russian to Korean to Syrian to Canadian. Wow. So it's really quite diverse. And, this is how I grew up. Bahrain is very small, by the way. So it's, the population is 1.6 million, and 50% of those, or maybe even more, 55% are expats. So even today, we have so much multiculturalism. And there's actually in the old town, there's a square kilometer that has a mosque, a synagogue, a Hindu temple, and a church, all kind of next to each other. And because we are very small, we do have a very small Jewish community. It's only like 40 Jews, so not very many. But they're really well integrated into Bahraini society. So again, growing up, we have Jewish members of the Shura Council, which is like the upper house of parliament appointed by the king. Our first female US ambassador, ambassador to the US, was a Bahraini Jewish woman. I grew up, a fun fact I like to share is I went to school with a girl who is younger than me, who's her father is an Iraqi Jew who came to Bahrain. So she's, half Bahraini, and she's reportedly the one who introduced Prince Harry and Meghan Markle.
Whoa.
Yes.
Some glitter.
Yeah. And that was never something that was, unusual for me growing up. I think a lot of the Jewish people I've spoken to outside, for example, in the US, have this misconception that we are taught at school to hate Jews. That was certainly not the case in our education here. In fact, and also people see me as very liberal. So, one thing sometimes people say to me is, oh, but you're different because you're so westernized or you're liberal. But actually, a lot of why I believe the things I do is because of my religion and because of my Islam classes and teachings that really promoted, compassion, interreligious, understanding. We grew up kind of revering stories of Moses as a prophet, as well as Jesus and other spiritual and religious figures. So, maybe that's something that I think a lot of people wouldn't know if they haven't been exposed to this culture and to Bahrain in particular.
You cannot even imagine how little people are exposed, to these issues and how important, what you are talking to us about today. When the first time that I visited Bahrain as a journalist in the time of war, it was the war, the second war in the Gulf, the 2003 war, when the Americans, toppled Saddam's regime. And I was in Bahrain, where is the Fifth American Fleet, covering the pre-war situation and also during the war itself, also, and so on. I have a training as a Middle Eastern expert. So I studied Middle Eastern studies for my BA and MA as well. And I never knew that, there was a substantial Jewish community in Bahrain. I didn't know that there was a synagogue. And only when I came back and I spoke to one of my Iraqi Jewish friends, actually, and he told me, "So, did you go to the synagogue?" I'm like, "Oh, no, I missed that. I didn't know that it exists because this is not something that was part of common knowledge, at least not at that time. So it was in the midst of the war on terrorism, and there were a lot of concepts about, what is Middle East and who are people from the Middle East and who are Arabs and what is their attitude towards the Jews. And well, yes, we do encounter very often, very radical positions and so on. But specifically in Bahrain, well, I felt that, first of all, it was very calm, even during the war. And very interesting mixture of cultures, indeed, like, you were saying. So basically, very, very, very recommended. What do you wish that people knew more about your country? You already touched based on that a little bit, but if there are some other, interesting facts and its position in the Middle East and relations with other countries, is there something else that you would want for us to know?
I mean, I think that's really the main kind of things that I think people should know that, probably are not as well known.
Bahrain is a part of the Abraham Accords. Since 2020 until now, what is the general sentiment in the country towards the Accords themselves and towards Israel? Because we do see sometimes there are demonstrations and so on. There is opposition there. There is some criticism. What can you tell about, how is it being perceived?
Yeah, so I will say that the majority of Bahrainis probably oppose normalization without a just solution to the occupation and statehood for the Palestinians. There's definitely been a surge of solidarity with the Palestinians since 10/7, but I think there's always been this solidarity with the Palestinian cause. Now, saying that, people have not suddenly become anti-Semitic. I think that many of the social media posts that I see, by people in the country, or at least within my, I suppose there's somewhat of a self-selection bias in the people that I am connected to or that I, follow on social media. But I often see a lot of reposts of things by Jewish authors, influencers, rabbis that also support the Palestinian cause in some way and Palestinian statehood. So I think that, none of us within the peace building civil society want a cold peace. I think we've seen it's very easy to sign a peace agreement between governments overnight, but what really matters is having a relational, not a transactional peace, but a relational peace that is rooted in justice, dignity, and respect, and also warm social relations, economic cooperation, people to people.
So in regards to that, I wanted to ask you about your personal involvement, with our organization, with ROPES, because ROPES connects between all of the dots, basically in the region that are usually not connected, Israelis and Palestinians, and Gulfis and Egyptians and Moroccans and everybody else as well. Actually, we have now participants from 15 Arab countries. Why it was important for you to be, part of that, to join, to meet other people, and given that you're dealing some mostly with not all solely, but mostly with issues of climate, science, and so on. You're on a big and you're a serial entrepreneur. So why geopolitics? Why it was important for you?
So there's a lot of layers to that question and for my answer. So maybe I'll start first. You mentioned my work in climate. Climate change doesn't care if you're Jewish or Muslim or Christian. The land, doesn't care if you are fasting for Ramadan, for Yom Kippur, for Lent. We are in a region that is going to be a preview for the rest of the world of, the worst of climate change with water scarcity, food insecurity. So I think it's really important that we unified in tackling some of these existential problems that affect us as a human race. But then on another level, I don't think any government in the world should be expected to solve all of society's problems or any social and political problems. I think it's incredibly important for civil society efforts. And what I've learned and before I got into climate change, I was more in international development. And what I've learned is, again, governments can sign a peace agreement overnight, but you can't wait that long to focus on the development, because then it takes generations for that peace to actually take root, which is why it's so important for me to be part of organizations like ROPES, because I think these are the foundations for durable peace and resilient peace that we need to start building or planting those seeds even before there's agreements, before governments. And then the third layer to that, I think, is, I've always been interested, in this sort of interfaith, interregional sort of diplomacy. At school, because I was in such an international school, I've always, had that sort of exposure. But I was also always drawn to resolving people's conflicts, whether it was between friends or, boyfriends, girlfriends. I was always taking this mediation role, and I really became fascinated by how two people can have such a different perception of the same incident, and also understanding people's feelings around the same thing that happened. So I guess we're drawn to certain archetypes. We're born and we kind of embody these certain roles that feel like this is the work I'm supposed to do in this life. And I think this is sort of, the work that I guess I was drawn to or felt natural to me.
I'm listening to you and I'm thinking about women in this global mediation issues and foreign policy in general. And I'm thinking, how the world could look like if there would be much more, women like you and many others that we have in our network. Because unfortunately, Amanda, looking at Israel, we have less and less. Somehow, instead of having more, we are having less. This was the unfortunate development of the last years.
I think women, and I would say also wisdom, if I look at a lot of, also the reason I'm drawn to a lot of this multi-faith work is I'm fascinated with the spiritual wisdom of all religions, the more mystic elements. So I'm not talking about prescriptive religion by the book, but I'm talking about Kabbalah or Buddhism or Christian mysticism, Sufism. I think that, wisdom is wisdom. It doesn't matter what religion it's coming from. And I think this is what's really missing in a lot of our leadership.
Absolutely. So I will ask another question about not only about ROPES, but about the role of civil society, NGOs, in the peace building effort. So you mentioned that, yes, we cannot wait for our leaders forever. And especially now, in these very traumatic times, it does seem like forever. It feels like forever. But at the same time, especially with such a profound and deep issues such as climate change, for example, yes, and combat against it. I'm looking at, the efforts of the many very distinguished organizations, also with whom we have partnerships and good relations, Arava Institute and, of course, EcoPeace and others. And I'm asking, that without doubt, the impact is very significant. But without the participation of the government, can you really stop, from rivers becoming dry, wasting water, with the old infrastructure, make progress in fighting against the desert swallowing more and more swaths of the land and so on. What do you think? What do you feel about it?
I mean, that's a big question. I think that as civil society, we don't have a choice. We need to do the work. And And of course, government either blocking or not supporting the work is a huge detriment to us, as citizens of countries, but also as a region, as a world. Often, and again, to go back to spirituality, often when I feel a sense of despair, like sometimes you look at the stats, the science, and you think, what's the point? Why should any of us even bother doing anything? But at the same time, I really believe that we are also the work. The work is not just reversing climate change. It's actually this collaboration and coming together and elevating our consciousness, our sense of interconnectedness, that, if you are destroying a watershed, it's not just going to affect another country, it's also going to affect you. It will affect the sanitation and health issues in your country. It will, if you are polluting and you're impacting climate change, the repercussions are global. We live in a system. It's not a linear system. It's a very interconnected system. And, one sort of one domino that falls somewhere can have a huge ripple effect. So I think it's really important to keep that in mind when we feel that sense of, why should we even bother doing this work?
Absolutely. Leena, you are both founder and CEO of Symbaiosys. Please tell our viewers and listeners more about that, and also what gave you the inspiration to start this venture, and where do you hope to take it?
Okay, so let me try and break it down so it's simple and not too technical. Basically, Symbiosis is looking at reimagining our relationship with nature. And the way that, the way we view nature is natural capital. So that's, everything nature does for free, from giving us water to purifying air to sequestering carbon to the services of bees, pollinating, to how much mangroves prevent sea level rise or flood damages, all of these things that nature does for free, and all the, the fruit, the food, the timber, all the resources. This is natural capital. This natural capital is around $140 trillion a year. That's 1.5 times global GDP. So nature is actually our biggest social and economic partner. And if we don't have a equitable, reciprocal relationship with the natural world, that partnership will no longer exist, and we will become extinct as a human species. So the work that we do at Symbiosis is three main things. One, we work on creating data sets, science-driven data sets that show the value of nature, show the value of ecosystem services, that tell you, what is the financial value of this river or this coral reef in flood protection, in tourism, in creating jobs, and all of these, in reducing your insurance liabilities, increasing your property values.
Clean air.
Clean air. So that's one part. It's, the sort of knowledge and data sets. The second part is we have a finance studio where we innovate these, new financial mechanisms and ways of looking at nature. So one that we're developing now is called an IPPO. So instead of an initial public offering, it's an initial public planet offering. What would it look like if nature was actually a 51% shareholder when a company goes public, and what is the governance structure, and what does that mean, and how does it actually benefit the company and the global economy in the long term? And then the third aspect of that is basically bringing people together to link issues like climate change, nature, and even peace and security. So I mentioned earlier that our region is going to be a preview of what's to come. So it's really about innovating blueprints that the rest of the world can follow, rather than us waiting for the rest of the world to create blueprints and we import them into our region, by which time it'll be too late.
What would you define as success, Leena?
Success for me is really reinventing our economic and governance models, where nature is actually represented as a board member, has a voice and a vote. I know that might sound very, science fiction, futuristic, but it's already happening. So I mentioned that the rights of nature movement in New Zealand and South America, and there's a lot of countries that are starting to have the rights of nature. There are companies like Patagonia that actually have nature has a board seat. So there is a nature proxy, which is a human who is representing nature's interests and decision making, vetoing and compensating nature. So for me, success is every business sees themselves as co-founded with nature, or sees nature as an investor and a shareholder in their business, and every government sees themselves as being in a PPP, a public-planet partnership with nature. And therefore, in a traditional PPP, a public-private partnership, of course, you're going to pay your private sector partner. Otherwise, what's in it for them? And it really should be the same thing with nature.
You were starting to tell us about, the source of inspiration. How do you get to it? Science fiction?
Yeah, so I've been in sustainability for 15 years. Before that, I was, more in communications and international development. And I think it was around 10 years ago when I really started to go much deeper into nature, and we were developing this methodology called public-planet partnerships. And during that time, I did a interspecies communication retreat at a lion conservation in South Africa. And it might sound, a little, when I say interspecies communication retreat, so the principle is that before language, humans always had a deep connection with nature. It was unspoken. It was just a way of knowing. It was a sacred contract of respect and interdependence. And we've lost that, we've modernized. And during this retreat, for the first, I've always loved nature, but for the first time, I had a deep respect for nature as an equal, not just something weak to be protected. And, I knew it intellectually, but it was the first time that it was embodied. I remember looking into a white lioness's eyes and seeing her as my sister, seeing this interspecies sisterhood, the same way I might look at it as a human of another nationality or race, as this human sisterhood, intercultural sisterhood. So that was really the seed, I guess, that first kind of planted the idea, and it sort of grew from there.
Every time, and I'm following very closely the news in the Middle East, and I see some developments. For example, there is a demonstration here, there is a wave of employment there. People are moving from countryside to the cities and so on. I think that in all of these cases, the question that is often omitted is what were the circumstances of, the water, air, crops, so how does it change the desert expansion, and so on, and how does it trigger the political processes? How does it influences us? I think that in the future, we must have this interdisciplinary studies that would perhaps work more on the, understanding this whole holistically, this process, not only in terms of, political discontent and so on, but also on the influence of this very basic part of our lives that we always think that we are taking it for granted until it's suddenly gone.
Yeah.
So getting on that, I wanted to also touch base and ask you about the book that you authored, Compassionate Counterterrorism, The Power of Inclusion in Fighting Fundamentalism. What was the spark that encouraged you to write this book? And, again, we are looking at what is happening today. there is, I think, not more success in combating terrorism and the roots of that than it used to be 10 or 20 years ago. So tell us first about the book, and then, the follow-up question would be about how, what the lessons that could be implemented today in 2026.
Yeah, so there was really three inflection points for me in writing Compassionate Counterterrorism. The first is I was living in New York during 9/11, and I couldn't understand how people raised in the religious tradition I was raised in could interpret my religion so differently and so perversely. Um, I, I mean, I talk about this in my book, but I was volunteering at Ground Zero with the Red Cross, and it was during Ramadan, and I was fasting, and I was so afraid to tell them every time they would, the rescue workers would say, "Why don't you take a break? Like, have something to eat, have something to drink." And I was so afraid to tell them I was fasting and that I was Muslim. I didn't know how they'd react. And they were, incredible. By the end of the day, I told them, and they just, hugged me, and it was this really beautiful moment of I saw actually how much that meant to them, and that I should have said it sooner rather than being afraid. And then there was a second incident in 2005. I was back in Bahrain, and some Navy SEALs that I was friends with lost half of their platoon in Afghanistan. And I was just very interested in, I always knew intuitively, maybe also as a woman, that violence wasn't the answer, that violence just perpetuates a cycle of violence. So I was very interested in researching, what are the nonviolent ways to approach, countering terrorism. And especially when the narrative at the time, especially around 9/11 and ISIS or Daesh, was really around, that they're driven by religion, when in reality, when I was coming across some of the research, actually a lot of, Islamist terrorists are anything but, not just because they commit acts of terrorism. I mean, that should go, without saying that this is already anti-Islamic, but, had never seen a Quran until they were in prison and incarcerated, like, Boko Haram in Nigeria, or
so it's not that there were some scholars or something like this.
No, or like 9/11 hijackers that had just, before the attacks had been in motels in Florida watching porn and, drinking alcohol and gambling in casinos, like all these things that are so counterintuitive. So that was really fascinating for me to understand, in order to understand how we might approach counterterrorism differently. And then the third catalyst, which I think is such a big one for me, is I was doing some consulting work with one of the largest peacebuilding organizations in the world, and they were nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. And, they told me this shocking statistic, which is that the 1 year of the US Department of Defense's budget could keep their NGO alive for 15,000 years.
Oh my God.
And when you still today look at the amount we invest in war and security versus peace building, it's just, it's just astounding. And so that was really the final straw that, pushed me to write this book and really examine terrorism. An act of terrorism is a tactic, but how do we humanize it and transform the conditions that lead to violent extremism? So that was really what pushed me to write this book.
So these days we hear a lot of talk about de-radicalization, and of course, different people use it in different scenarios and meanings. They give it to it different meanings. Also, for example, Russian president wants to de-radicalize the Ukrainians, which is, of course, a nonsense and absurd. But if you are speaking indeed about people who were brainwashed by extreme organizations, whether, they're Daesh, or whether they are us, or whether they are radical settlers, who also have this idea of violently pushing, the other one out of the frame, and then to just, live happily ever after. What really can be done today when they already have been, in this, through this indoctrination, in order to change radically, their thoughts, their ideas, and to influence the majority. You can never influence 100%, but to let them understand that, the dialogue is the only way. There is nothing else. The humanity didn't invent anything else because it cannot be something else but dialogue and understanding.
That is such a complicated question to answer, and I'm going to try and answer it with as much care as I can. First of all, I want to, as you kind of rightfully, noted in your sort of asking the question, people have very different interpretations of terrorism, and there is actually no internationally agreed upon definition of terrorism because it's very much the label has shifted throughout history. For example, when I think of Mandela being labeled a terrorist, and I think most traditional definitions will say it's a non-state actor committing, an act for political means. In the work that I do and in my personal definition, what matters most is not who commits it, when who commits the violence, whether it's militias or lone wolves or heads of state, it's who suffers from it. And so for me, I define terrorism as the use of violence by state or non-state actors to instill fear in civilian populations for political means. And that matters because, when terrorism is only framed as something the other side does, you're creating moral blind spots because guaranteed the other side is viewing you as the terrorist. It doesn't mean we have to agree with the other side. I just think it's very important to understand that distinction because, as you said, without, you need dialogue because if both sides just think, well, you're the terrorist and I'm going to annihilate you, you just have an endless cycle of violence. What I can share in terms of insights from writing my book and interviewing people I interviewed a founder of one of the largest neo-Nazi groups who ended up exiting the movement and is now a peace educator. I've interviewed the son of a terrorist who actually assassinated Meir Kahane, the Jewish rabbi, and then masterminded the 1993 World Trade Center bombing while he was in jail. I've worked on reconciliation, during the Arab Spring, obviously this work that we do together. And in every context, what I've learned is exclusion is not a byproduct of violent extremism, it's a prerequisite for it. And only through inclusion and belonging. And when I say inclusion, I mean social inclusion, political inclusion, economic inclusion, that you can interrupt that trajectory. When we look at extremist groups, which, by the way, if we want to tackle extremism, we have to acknowledge we're competing with these extremist groups. So if we want to, successfully de-radicalize, we need to offer people something that they've failed to provide, rather than pushing them towards, these extremist groups in order to find something that we've failed to provide. So essentially, we have to outperform extremist groups if we want to de-radicalize. We have to provide basic human needs, or otherwise we leave this vacuum. I also think it's important to look at what hasn't worked. So you and I, we can look and see, in our kind of lifetimes, we can see these cycles of violence, but also historically, military interventions have led to less than 7% of the demise of terrorist organizations in the last 50 years. Wow. So with the least amount of success with religious groups, and I say religious because really, if they were religious, they wouldn't be committing acts of terrorism, but I think it's time that we consider an alternative approach if we're serious about peace. And I can, I'm not going to get into all the stats, but in the book, I go in extensive detail about how military interventions can actually exacerbate the conditions and allow more extremism to thrive. I'm not saying that you shouldn't have security, but there is a lot of research. But ultimately, what my prescription would be is, we're spending trillions on war, billions on counterterrorism, and soberingly, less than 0.1% of that on peace. And yet, terrorist groups have increased fivefold since 2000 or since 2001, since 9/11. Attacks are increasing globally. Terrorism is up, I think, 4% this year. And it's in every continent, the Americas, Australia, Asia, Africa. So my suggestion to policymakers is, first of all, you need to measure success not just by the threats you're eliminating, but by the number of people who no longer feel that they are driven to the language of violence. And you need to invest more in peace. Literally, financially, invest more in peace, because if you plant weeds, you're not going to get pomegranate trees. So if we're serious about peace, then maybe we need to start investing in it.
Leena, I want to basically write down what you said right now about investing in peace and send it to every diplomat and official in every government on earth. I think they need to be reminded of that. I just, had a few encounters with, some diplomats from Europe and US, last weeks. From what I heard of them, for now, they're taking a very different direction. So this is a little bit sobering, but we do know that at some point, changes happen without you even anticipating them. So that might change as well. Leena, so our time is running out, but before we will, finish our conversation, I want to ask you a question about hope. We are speaking, it's the beginning of 2026, and this year is, anything but easy. This year is full already of conflicts and problems and tragedies and so on. But at the same time, this is also a year of ceasefire that was reached in Gaza. It seems that, there is a glimpse of hope. What do you wish for the Middle East in 2026? What do you want to happen?
I'm not sure we can answer that in a short. If I had to summarize it, the essence of it for me that would impact everything else is just having greater wisdom in all of our institutions and our leadership, because when you're acting with wisdom, automatically justice, compassion, belonging, all of these things, this moral intelligence, I think, that we need, where extremism declines and belonging increases, and we start seeing a more resilient region, a more resilient world, and a region, and actually humanity that is in a reciprocal relationship with life itself. So not destroying the ecosystems, the operating system that gives us, makes life on Earth possible.
Thank you very much for that, Leena Al Olaimy. Words of wisdom, and we will also publish in the link in the description of this episode a link to your book. Go, if you didn't read it until now, you absolutely must. This is a heartfelt recommendation on behalf of ROPES. Thank you again, Leena. We hosted today Leena Al Olaimy, an activist, entrepreneur, and an expert on climate and counterterrorism from Bahrain. We hope that you enjoyed this episode. If you want to learn more about ROPES and our groundbreaking work with the young leaders of the Middle East, please visit our website, ropes.org. Don't forget to like this episode and also to subscribe to our podcast, where we profile voices of those who support peace, reconciliation, and dialogue in the Middle East and the whole of MENA region. Shalom and salam. I'm Ksenia Svetlova.